Welcome, everyone, and thank you for taking the time to join us for today's webinar in our webinar series, Building Better Research, RCT Design Implementation. Before we begin, please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be made available on our website and shared via email in the upcoming weeks. By participating in the session, you are consenting to being recorded. I'm Raquel and I work as a Senior Policy Associate for JPL Africa, and I'm joined today by Professor Mohammed Meki, a JPL-affiliated professor and associate professor at the University of Oxford. Mohammed will be presenting on building a portfolio of randomized controlled trials. Please feel free to add questions to the chat throughout the webinar. I'd now like to hand over to Mohammed.
Thank you very much, Raquel, and thank you everyone for joining, and thank you, JPAL, for organizing this session. So as Raquel mentioned, I'm very happy. I want this to be like a dynamic kind of session and to get interaction as much as possible. I'll be sharing some of my thoughts as a guiding framework for how one can think about constructing a portfolio of RCTs, and what I think is a helpful guiding framework building on like finance type of portfolio construction thinking, but very much look forward to kind of hearing your own thoughts, your own insights about challenges to implementing a portfolio of research. And so feel free to either put the questions on the chat or just interrupt me. I would like discussion throughout if possible, rather than just at the end. Okay. So I'll begin with a disclaimer. And so this, as I said, is a kind of personal perspective on what I find to be a helpful guiding metaphor for building a research portfolio of RCTs. And so this is based on my own limited experience working on a few projects, but also observing the kind of research trajectories of other researchers, both early career researchers and later career researchers, and just observing the field of our field of development economics. So I think it's a guiding framework, but it's obviously my own personal perspective. And I'm someone who's coming from a more financy type of background anyway, in terms of my professional background and the kind of work that I do. So it kind of biases me towards finance metaphors for thinking about building a research agenda. On that note, there is no right and wrong. So even if we decide to like think about building a portfolio using some of the finance metaphors that I'll discuss, there is no right or wrong in terms of how you build an investment portfolio when it comes to finance. So for example, some people would tell you that you should diversify a lot, have lots of different types of investments, and because you're kind of reducing risk. Then there are some very successful investors who don't diversify. They really invest a lot in one particular stock, one particular company, and they've become very successful in doing that. And you can see similarities when it comes to research. And so, I'll be discussing a little bit about how you may want to diversify in terms of topics or in terms of which areas you work in. But then we also see cases of very successful researchers who have worked on one topic only or mostly, and who have only worked in one particular area. And so there is no right and wrong. It really depends on things which are heterogeneous. And so specifically, there is heterogeneity in interests. And so like everyone in this room would have topics that they are more or less interested in. So I'm very much interested in the intersection of finance and development, but there are others here who would be interested in education, in health, in labor economics, environmental, and various other topics. And for some people, they're just interested in several different topics. And so it makes sense for them that they would naturally diversify in terms of like the topics that they work on. Whereas for others, they are mostly interested in one or two topics. And so it feels more natural for them to focus their research agenda on those particular topics. Or for strategic reasons, and we shouldn't always be strategic. Sometimes it helps to be a bit strategic, but I think it's better to combine that with following your own particular interest. For some people, they think that a particular topic is going to be of interest for the next 5, 10, 20 years, and other topics are going to be of less interest and relevance. And so that can also be a factor. Another thing, when we think about what an optimal portfolio looks like using a finance analogy, it also depends on risk preferences. When a financial advisor is advising an investor or a client on what type of investments to hold in their portfolio. It really depends on the tolerance that an individual has for risk. So if we just know that people differ in their risk preferences. Some people are very entrepreneurial, they have a high tolerance for risk, and so they would choose riskier investments. And so with a finance type of analogy, they're more likely to go into like high growth stocks or equities with a high expected return, but also high variance, a high volatility. Whereas others prefer a much kind of like safer type of investment, which is like more fixed income, more less uncertainty. And so it's a similar thing when it comes to research portfolio construction, in my view, which is that, there are some areas which we may think are safer areas to work on, and there are some areas which maybe feel a little bit riskier, but the potential upside is much more. And so our tolerance for risk is really quite heterogeneous, and that will affect what is kind of optimal. And the third thing that I wanted to briefly mention is the heterogeneity and constraints. So it's fine for me to sit here and say, okay, I'm not going to do this, but if I were to say, this is what I think an optimal portfolio of research projects would look like based on your interests and risk preferences, the reality is that we can't all optimize our portfolio in a completely unconstrained way. So just like when we're using a finance analogy, we may think, okay, an investor would like to have some portion of their investments in this sector and some in this sector, some in equities, some in fixed income. That's an unconstrained type of portfolio construction. And the reality is when many people are constrained in their ability to even make some of these choices. So I could sit here and say, okay, you should have some research in this continent and some research in this country and some research in this topic and some research in another topic. And you should work with this type of co-author and that type of research partner. But the reality is we need funding often to get research. We don't always have access to the networks that allow us to work in different contexts that we're not familiar with, that we don't already have contacts in. And so I know that JPAL and organizations like JPAL are really doing a lot of great work to break down some of those barriers, to help people and build these networks. And some of these events are in that spirit. But I just wanted to mention that some of this optimal portfolio thinking is very difficult when people face certain constraints, either in terms of funding or in terms of being able to access projects or access teams. And so it's very much thinking about what an aspirational portfolio would look like if we were able to make some of these decisions, which for many of us were a little bit more constrained in doing that. And particularly for earlier career researchers, for more experienced researchers who have already access to many networks and have a long track record, perhaps they would receive many more offers of new projects, new ideas, which vary across sector, vary across topic. And so they have this ability to construct a portfolio in a slightly less constrained way, which is to say, oh, I'll say yes to this project and no to this project because I'd like to work in this topic, or I'd like to work on this sector. Whereas, as we all know, for an earlier career researcher, you're more likely to say yes to things because you feel like you need projects. You feel like you need to start building your research portfolio from having nothing or very few projects. And so this kind of like choosing what to work on, where to work is much less of a luxury for somebody who's at a very early stage. And it feels much more intense about, I just need to work on a few projects, get them successful, get them out, and start building my profile as a researcher. And so I can't really do this kind of big picture thinking about portfolio construction, but I wanted to say that I think this can still be helpful for those times when you are in a position to make some choices. You're getting offers for different projects, different collaborations, and it helps you just think about, okay, where am I heading? Because without stopping and thinking about what kind of research portfolio am I trying to build, what kind of areas am I trying to work on, and just saying yes to everything, or just saying yes to any funding opportunity that arrives, we may inadvertently walk into situations that later we feel are not optimal. Like later we feel that, oh, we've concentrated too much of our research on a particular topic or working with a particular individual, and that brings kind of like co-author or co-researcher concentration risk or in a particular sector. So it helps to kind of like keep this framework in the back of the mind, even if it isn't something that can be actively kind of optimized at this stage. Okay, so what's the roadmap? I plan to discuss a couple of projects that I've been involved in at different stages. One is a completed project, and one is a working paper, which is a working paper, so it's still kind of a living document. And just to think about two specific cases and to share my kind of story behind those projects, and some reflections, and then some more general reflections on building a research portfolio of hopefully innovative RCTs. One is something that I've mentioned already, which is this concept of diversification. So diversification across topics, geography, teams, etc. So I want to talk about that broad point. A second is on due diligence. So thinking about RCTs in particular, we're often conducting RCTs with an implementing partner. And so there are times when there's a temptation, especially if we're in an earlier stage of our careers, there's a temptation if we have an idea for a project and we think that the project is interesting and important, there's a temptation to just say yes when we find an implementing partner who's willing to implement that project. And that can be a dangerous thing to do without having done the due diligence on that organization. Because while it's important that we have an organization that's open-minded to research and willing to cooperate, it can really lead to problems down the line implementing the project if it's an organization that doesn't have the capacity to implement the project. So there is due diligence that one can and should do as much as possible to understand, is this the right organization that I choose to implement my project with? And part of that, as well as the kind of initial due diligence before even engaging in a pilot, part of that is, as well as just like more abstractly thinking about the organizational structure and due diligence, actually piloting, like putting all of this to the test, right? And so, there are many benefits to piloting, and I'll talk about a few of those. And also really, again, I want to emphasize that this is somewhere where I'd love to hear feedback from yourselves on your own experiences with piloting, with engaging with institutions, things that you feel researchers should be aware of when they engage in that initial conversation with implementing partners, and potential red flags that would indicate that this is a risky partner to work with. Of course, as I said before, JPAL are already doing some of this work to reduce some of these risks for researchers. So, for example, on the implementing partner side, I know there are initiatives where many of us would have seen initiatives where JPAL have already had some of those initial conversations with potential implementing partners to understand their willingness to engage in research and to even understand the methodology that one is required to respect for RCT. So again, a lot of work is being done there, but nonetheless, when it comes to the specifics of a particular project, there are still requirements for due diligence and piloting, I think. And of course, once we've constructed this portfolio of research, we have some projects which we are working on in various different areas. There are some points to reflect upon in terms of like what happens after the projects begin getting implemented, what happens in terms of the production of the paper, resolving issues with the project. And some of this would again be related to the portfolio construction perspective, because when we're thinking about, for example, the teams that we're working with, like having who do you work with in your different projects? Thinking about the complementarity of contributions from different members of the team is going to be important both for the implementation of the project and the design of the project, but also for the writing process. And that's another factor to consider, and which I will briefly touch on. Okay, so unless anyone has any initial comments, I'll proceed to discuss the first project that I was involved in, and this was in Pakistan. And so this is a project in kind of finance and development, microfinance space. And the problem that we were seeking to address is that for many small firms that are looking to expand their business, for example, with the purchase of a large fixed asset for their business, like an expensive machine, The existing microfinance products are often inappropriate because the financing amount is too small to buy that big lumpy investment or the big asset that's needed for business expansion, or the structure of the contract is too rigid and doesn't allow the kind of risk sharing that many small firms maybe would benefit from. And so it's very much kind of rigid debt-based contracts. And so we worked with a partner who had who had been lending to these small businesses. And we can identify businesses that have a desire to grow. It's not just subsistence level businesses that need to expand. But the existing finance amount that the partner was giving to them was too small to make those bigger investments. And so we designed a product which helped these small businesses finance a larger investment for a fixed asset in their business. So this was definitely like a co-production of co-design with an implementing partner and with the research team. And so it's a published paper. It's with my co-authors Faisal Bari, Kashif Malik, and Simon Quinn. It's in Pakistan. And we find large impacts from this contract, which we designed to finance this large asset. So it was successful in the sense that the product itself was quite successful, and we managed to implement the experiment. So that's all I'll say about the paper itself. Let me talk a little bit about the kind of story behind the paper. And so this started as when I was a research assistant for Simon Quinn on a different project, but in Pakistan. As a research assistant, you often get experience in the field, understanding both the project that you're working on as well as the institutional context more broadly. And this really came about from just having informal conversations about research with others while I was in the field. And so that's something that others have encouraged, and I would definitely encourage, which is just to pitch ideas to people, to your colleagues, both academics, but also practitioners, and in my case, it was to banks, and just pitch some ideas and get feedback. And so that's the process how this project worked. The other thing was that it started with a very small grant. And so, sometimes when we have an idea and we think, oh, this is a really good idea, we want the big grant straight away because, for various reasons, we're in a hurry to implement it. Maybe we think, this needs to be done very quickly. But we applied for a big grant and we got rejected from it, and we were offered a small grant. And again, I was very appreciative of Pedal in this particular case because they rejected us for a large grant and they gave us a small grant, and there was really good feedback from the referees from that rejection. Which I'll talk a little bit about rejection. We're human. I think everyone in this room is human. I don't think we have any bots, but we're human. Rejection hurts, right? And so, like, sometimes rejection comes with feedback. And that feedback can be useful. In this particular case, it was really useful in terms of simplifying the experimental design. And then from that smaller fund, we piloted and then eventually we applied for large funding from IPA. And so on that note, piloting with that smaller amount of funding really helped expose some weaknesses in the original design of the project. And so this was a case where we designed some very innovative financial contract, and one particular small business owner, let's just say, misbehaved with that contract. But that really indicated to us, even though it was just one individual in a relatively small pilot, it showed us fragility with that design that we had. And so that was very useful for us to just get back to the drawing board and say, listen, if this has issues at such a small scale, then we really need to go back to the drawing board. And so it's, as I said, very important to just kind of have this feedback process. And the paper itself, even after implementing a project with a particular design, sometimes when you look at a published paper, you think it looks like it was all very straightforward to get to that final narrative and the final kind of story that's being told by the paper. But papers can develop in unexpected ways. When a project is designed, you might have in mind a certain narrative, a certain story for how the mechanisms could play out. And of course, it's important to write pre-analysis plans and to pre-specify the analysis that's going to be done. But inevitably, in research, different things emerge as part of the process. And when you have your results, you can often take a paper in a different direction, right? And so that's just the reality of the process. And that's why it's important both to have a good team that you can brainstorm with when it comes to writing papers, but also this process of getting feedback, because part of the way that we benefited in terms of the writing of the paper was sending our introduction to colleagues, and just having their perspective on the way that we were writing our paper, right? And so that was very helpful. This is a project about fixed costs, right? So I said this is a project about fixed asset financing. So like $2,000 asset that we were financing in this project in a situation in which the small businesses only had access to a $500 loan. So like a really fixed cost. And so like there's an analogy here with research, right? And thinking about geographic diversification, which I will talk about. It's one could, for example, think, okay, I would like a geographically diversified portfolio of research. I'd like to do some work in like East Africa, some work in West Africa, some work in North Africa, some work in South Asia, and I could choose some regions. But the reality is, to start a project, there's a huge fixed cost of starting a project, right? Because you have to learn about the context, ideally with some good qualitative work, going to the field, speaking to implementing partners, engaging with the participants, understanding the infrastructure in terms of data collection, and so on and so forth. And so it's a big initial cost that you have to pay before you can conduct research in a particular location. And so to pay that fixed cost in like several different countries and several different regions can be quite difficult for individuals. And that's why sometimes you see that it's easier once you've paid that fixed cost for a particular project. Like, you've started working in Pakistan, you've built some networks, you have some contacts, some institutions who are willing to engage. It can be then easier to do the second project and the third project in that particular setting. And so we've done that, and we're doing that. We're proceeding on a project which finances assets specifically for women, which is something that comes out of our initial project, but it was just like a quite natural progression for us to stay in that context, and then develop a second project. The second project that I wanted to briefly discuss is a project in Kenya. And so the motivation with this is that we were working with a large multinational company who came to the business school in Oxford, and they were looking for new ways of essentially engaging with their stakeholders. So let me just show you a picture to indicate who their stakeholders were. It's essentially a company that produces chewing gum, and in Kenya, and then sells it to customers through these distributors who are not formal employees, but they're kind of entrepreneurs, they call them, but they're basically micro distributors. And so the company, this was a large multinational company that came to the business school in Oxford and was looking for ways to better engage with its stakeholders, and in particular the distributors. And so what we identified was that many of these distributors were credit constrained and would benefit from a simple transportation asset, in this particular case a bicycle, to help them move around and sell more products. And so this was a case where there was a mutually beneficial intervention. So we thought that if we helped finance this transportation asset for these distributors, it could be very beneficial to them by increasing their incomes, increasing their ability to travel around and sell more of their product. And at the same time, the large company which produces the product and sells it to them would also benefit. So this was a mutually beneficial engagement. And then we worked together to design an RCT. And so this is a working paper with my colleagues Francesco, Marcel, Collins, Simon, and Kate. And that's all I'll say about the paper itself. We found quite large impacts for a kind of innovative financial contract, which has slightly more kind of equity-like, has some more performance contingent repayments. And so this is a case where we worked with a financial institution which was willing to experiment with a novel kind of contract which shared risk and reward better than a standard debt contract. And so, thinking about the story behind this working paper, this was a conversation that began with an open-minded multinational company. So this is a company which wanted to develop new business models of engaging with their stakeholders. And so we engaged with them. My colleague Kate, she spent a lot of time in Kenya doing qualitative work, speaking to these micro distributors, understanding the constraints, understanding what kind of interventions could actually help them. And then once we had an agreement from the company on designing an experiment and implementing different financial contracts, it really required some effort to, well, firstly, it did require effort to explain methodology. So this was not one of those cases where, for example, JPAL are pre-screening an organization to help them understand the methodology of RCTs. This is one of the cases where, like many people in this room would have worked on cases where you're trying to engage with a partner who doesn't really have a good idea of the methodology in an RCT, and particularly the need for data collection, a control group, minimizing attrition, and maintaining experimental protocol. So that did require some effort. And as I said, there are measures in place now to do some pre-screening, but even with pre-screening, often people need reminding throughout the project of the importance of following the experimental protocol. And especially when things look like they start to work, right? So, we operate on different timelines. So like researchers operate on a very different timeline to some corporate firms, for example, some private sector firms. And so with a private sector firm, it's more natural to them if it looks like a certain intervention is working to say, okay, let's just like shut this thing down. Like, why do we need a control group anymore? It looks like this is the thing that's working. Let's just like pivot towards that thing, and there's no need to follow this experimental protocol. And as researchers, we need to follow the protocol. We need to follow the timeline in terms of the data collection period and respecting the assignment process, right? The randomization process. And so that's something that does require, in many cases, a reminder to the implementing partner, especially when things look like they're going well. And, a similar thing would be if things look like they're not going well with a particular treatment arm or in the intervention. And so, yeah, I've mentioned this, but, without any disrespect, like the corporate attention is very different to kind of research kind of timelines, because they're much more, they're much quicker in terms of like wanting to like try new things, pivot to the things that seem that are working, and shut down the things that don't seem like they're working. So you should know that from the outset. You should know whether there is a fundamental misalignment between the deliverables and the requirements of that potential implementing partner and of the researcher. There's very little points of engaging in a collaboration where you need to wait like 1 or 2 years to carefully measure the impact of a project, but the implementing partner will tell you from the outset that there's no way that they're waiting 2 years to learn about the results, right? And so that's a conversation that needs to be had very early, and sometimes there's that misalignment can never be dealt with appropriately. And in other cases, you can still provide some sort of deliverable to them, even if it's not the kind of end-line survey impact evaluation. Many organizations find baseline summary statistics and baseline analysis very, very beneficial, and baseline correlations. And so that's a conversation that just should happen quite early. I'll just quickly look at one of the questions on the chat. Yeah, so there's a question from Tunde about the time frame between when one administers an intervention and the evaluation. And so this very much, it's a great question, and this very much depends on like the nature of the intervention. So, for example, when I think about the cases that I've been involved with, if we're financing a large asset for a business. So for example, we're financing a new machine, a new manufacturing machine for a small manufacturing company. It's a very big asset. It's going to take a long time for them to initially figure out how to use, like, for example, let's say we're working with somebody who's just like sewing clothes by hand, and then they're going to buy some sophisticated sewing machine and other pieces of machinery that work with that. It's going to take time to adjust to that, capital adjustment period, right? To learn how to use that new asset. If the type of product that's being produced as a result is slightly different, then maybe take some time to like sell that product, to engage with different types of customers. And so it's going to take a few months before the company has even adjusted to that change. And in those few months, they may underperform relative to what they were performing before. And so the true impact and they're making initial high payments on their financing. And so the true impact of the intervention may not be for a year or 2 years, 3 years. And so we see that with some of the literature on like microfinance, small businesses, is that some of the short-term impacts are hard to detect, but we do need like 1, 2 year, 3 year, and some people have even collected longer-term impact evaluations. So in my particular case, I can answer that with like 6 months intervention. 6 month impact evaluation is not satisfactory anymore for this kind of intervention that I discussed. We really need 1 year data, 2 year data, 3 year data. But this could very much differ depending on your context. So for example, if it's an educational intervention, it may be like an academic year that's sufficient to get some sort of initial impact on exam scores, etc. Of course, there will be longer term impacts, and the more you can measure like medium and long term impacts, I think that's more informative for readers of your research. But of course, it becomes very difficult to, for example, keep a control group for a very long period of time when we're implementing intervention. So that's just like a constraint. I hope that partially answers the question. Now, moving away from thinking about, and this is another case where we've stayed in Kenya to work on another project. It's a different implementing partner, but it's just a setting where we spent a lot of time learning about transportation in Kenya and distribution in Kenya, and now we're working on an electrical vehicle project for two-wheelers in Kenya. So it's another case where we've paid that fixed cost of like learning about the setting a little bit, and it felt natural to proceed with a second project. Now, just some general thoughts on diversification. So this is Warren Buffett, who is a very well-known investor, one of the most well-known investors in the world. And he's basically criticizing a little bit diversification, the concept of diversification. Anyone who doesn't know Warren Buffett, he's somebody who didn't diversify much in his early career. Like he really had strong views on a few companies that he thought were going to do very well, and he invested a lot of money in those companies. So he really like took a risk on a few companies, and he did very well of that. And I think his view is that if he'd invested in lots and lots of different companies, tiny amounts, he wouldn't have been as successful as he was. Then others do argue for diversification, and diversification can really help. So using the same analogy of investment in companies, diversification helps you with company-specific risk. So if I'm investing all of my money in one particular company, or if I'm putting all my effort in one particular project, there's a risk if that thing fails, or if the country in which the project is implemented fails, that I lose all of my money, right? I just lose everything. There's this company-specific risk or project-specific risk that diversification can help with. In finance, diversification across sectors. Some sectors do well, some sectors don't do well. And just having assets where there's a less correlation between the performance of those assets, there are benefits with. But of course, diversification doesn't help with like market-wide crashes, like the whole market's suffering, like a global financial crisis. Diversification doesn't really help, right? So if all of our projects are in development economics and there are big things happening in development, as we all know, there are big things. That's a risk that we're all going to, at some level, suffer from, and the extent to which you're diversified isn't really going to help you with that global shock that our field is facing. And of course, there's a risk of over diversification. If we decide to have 100 projects that we're working on, there's no like human that I know that can really give their time to 100 projects, and you're not going to do justice to those 100 projects. So there is a risk of over diversification in projects, just as there is with finance. So which particular aspects of diversification in research portfolios do I often find myself coming to think about? And again, I'd welcome any thoughts anyone has here. It's topics. And I've mentioned this briefly before. From my own perspective, I'm interested in this intersection of finance and development. But for others, they would have multiple topics that they're interested in: health, education, labor. And so it can make sense to diversify across those topics, especially if some of those topics may do less well than others in the future. And so that's something that people should think about. I've not chosen to diversify in topics myself, but that's more because of my own personal interest in finance and development. But one should question whether they should be working on 10 different topics, right? Especially when we're sometimes given advice early in our careers that it can be beneficial to be known for working on a particular topic. If you're somebody who works on like 10 different topics, maybe you're like diluting a little bit too much, right? And so that's just something to think about. Geography, right? Again, I said at the beginning, not everyone is able to just work in different geographies, but for those who do have the ability to choose projects, to work in different geographies, note that geographical diversification or potential geographical diversification can be important, right? Many of us would know people who had many projects in one particular country, and something happened in that country, and all of their projects got shut down, all their projects got delayed severely. And I know people when I was doing my PhD who are in that situation. And so having some like geographic diversification can really, really be helpful to protect you against shocks in that particular country. And we just know of cases where research is not possible in a particular country because of something that's happened in the whole country. And if you're exposed to that, it can be really painful because all of your projects basically stop. At the same time, we can think of researchers who have been very successful working a lot in a particular country, and some of those successful researchers have built links really high up in those countries to the extent where they're doing experiments with the governments of the countries on a really high level. So there are benefits sometimes to really having a regional focus. And of course, some of us, as I said before, heterogeneity in interest. Some of us are just interested in a particular region more than others. We feel like we have more of a contribution to make in a particular region. So that affects the extent to which we would work on a particular region. I think diversification research teams is an important aspect which probably doesn't get discussed as much. And it's also important for the paper production process. So for example, if, maybe you find a person who is your like favorite co-author, and you decide, okay, I'm going to do all my projects with this particular individual because, I just like working with this particular individual. Then you have a lot of concentration risk. Like what happens if that particular individual, something happens to them and they're not able to dedicate the time to all of those projects that you're working with them on? Things are all getting stuck on their desk. For example, if they're responsible for a particular aspect of the project or of the paper writing, then you really have a lot of concentration risk, right? And so one should think at least about the possibility of diversifying the range of teams that you're working with. And then even within the teams, what are different people contributing to those teams, right? Both at the project stage, is this person more kind of hands-on in terms of implementation, liaising with partners, data collection, or more on the conceptual design aspects? And some people are less involved at the implementation stage, but that they have a very strong track record at the writing stage, at the model development stage, if there's a model in the paper. And so I think it's important to think about like the teams that we're joining and like what we're bringing to the team, what others are bringing to the team, potential risks if we're overly concentrated or over reliant on a particular individual for many of our projects. And then there's diversification across implementing partners. So again, there's a risk that if you do all of your projects or many of your projects with a particular implementing partner, that if something happens with that implementing partner, things could go wrong. And unfortunately, we've heard of stories where, for example, with survey companies, individuals who have had many projects with a particular survey company, and there have been issues with a particular survey company. That's a big risk that you're then running, which is that if there's some issue with that particular survey company, a lot of your projects really suffer. And then there's a slightly more subtle one, which is like the time dimension, right? And so we all know that with projects, there are really intense periods of project implementation. Maybe there are times where we have to be really in the field for the launch of the baseline survey or the launch of a big wave of implementation. And then once implementation has proceeded and we're in data collection phase, it's a little bit less intense. But it makes sense to think about whether you're engaging in projects where, for example, all of the big implementation rollout wave is happening in September on multiple projects, right? That's just like a lot of work, especially if it's happening at the beginning of the academic semester or something like this. It's just something to be wary of, which is like, when are these pressure points, and how do your timelines align with those pressure points? Okay, let me just quickly look at the question. So the question about research reporting. Okay, maybe I'll actually let Raquel come in here if she wants at some point, on the coordination between the grantor and the client towards reporting. Okay. Before that, let me talk a little bit about something that I've hinted at, which is risks with organizations that we are working with to implement, and just thinking about those risks before we implement a project. So I've mentioned that when we're considering an implementing partner, it's very important to try and understand, firstly, try and reflect upon what you want out of a particular project. And often as academics, we want to implement the project successfully. We'd like to write an impactful research paper, publish it. And then think about the objectives of the implementing partner, because very often they're not the same as ours, right? So they're more interested in shorter term impacts very often. And so check that there's not a fundamental misalignment in these things. And that's very important conversation to have and thing to think about. Also, their ability to deal with shocks, their ability to implement the project, to have the capacity to implement the project, and their ability to adapt when the project is maybe not going so well. Many projects would face some frictions. Similarly with survey companies, one should do the due diligence. There may be a temptation to just go with the survey company that's most willing, or the cheapest survey company, but what's their track record? What are their protocols, their staff turnover, and any kind of bottlenecks on that side? Funders and deliverables, and I think that's Sartika's question about research reporting and coordination between researcher and grantor. I think my own experience, but like Raquel, please feel free to talk, is that the funders like JPAL are very clear at the beginning, at the contracting stage, about the expectations, the deliverables, the timelines. And my own experience, they've been quite flexible on and having that conversation with the researcher about when are realistic timelines, what are realistic deliverables, and if something's happened, like I found most funders to be very empathetic about things that have happened in the country that lead to delays, that will require extensions. But I mean, Raquel, you can say something better than what I've just said, I think.
Thanks, Mohammed. I think from JPL's perspective, it's helpful for us to know like what's the objective. So we do look at like when we receive proposals, like is the objective to eventually run an RCT if it's a pilot, or where is it going towards, and do you want to write a paper? So we are interested in funding projects that would eventually want to write a paper. I think what's also helpful to us is like, even if it doesn't work out, like, so you run a pilot and you don't end up applying for RCT funding after that, or the RCT doesn't work out for some reason, like we also learn a lot from that. So we like to know why it did not work out, like what happened with the implementing partner or in the country, and all of that information is also for us valuable to be included like in narrative reports and so on. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but we understand that there's a lot of different realities that you're dealing with in the field, with working with the implementing partner, and then like things that can happen in the country as well. And we're interested to like hear like, what did you learn and what did you find out, even if it didn't work out exactly as planned.
Yeah, I think that's a great response. And like, it made me think that, like, again, I feel like the funders have evolved over the years, and I think they're much more kind of appreciative of exploratory work. I think like JPA have these exploratory grants, even like qualitative grants and piloting grants, where, if it doesn't go well in terms, like, I mean, we learn from all research, right? But we can learn from all research. But if it doesn't go well in the sense it doesn't lead to a very large scale experiment, JPAL are not going to get angry with you, right? Like it's like, JPAL themselves are funding a portfolio of research, right? They're taking risks, right? Like they think things are interesting, they acknowledge that things are high risk, and sometimes they give small amount of money to things that are high risk, and they know that they're not all going to lead to large scale evaluations, but I think there is a tolerance there, and um, Tunde has a follow-up question about, whether the dynamism of an individual's portfolio should be time varied. And again, this is like a personal thing, but it may be the case that when one is earlier in their career, right, so earlier career research, it makes more sense to focus on a few specific topics and maybe even particular settings. You become like a bit of an expert in that. And once you've established yourself a little bit, maybe you can diversify a little bit geographically or in terms of sector, perhaps. Okay, so I think I've only got like 10 minutes left. I'm going to leave a few minutes for questions. Piloting can be really, really beneficial. We've already touched a little bit on this and some of the benefits of piloting. People have written about this topic already. Of course, we know that it's important to test our survey instruments. I've never seen a survey that's not shown weaknesses once being piloted by enumerators and participants. It's just the natural process of it. We test an instrument and then we get feedback, and then we go back to the drawing board with certain questions. It helps us refine questions, hypotheses, feasibility, scope, but it also helps us stress test the things that I talked about before. So it's fine to have a due diligence process on your institutional partner, on your survey company, on your co-authors. That's all fine. You can do a theoretical due diligence process. It can show you, even from that kind of like abstract due diligence process, that this company is too risky, this individual is too risky to work with, etc. You can do that. But even once someone's past that initial pre-screening phase, you really stress test the relationship with a pilot, because then you understand, like, okay, can they actually implement this on a small scale? Can they adapt to changing of the survey? Can they adapt to changing of the design? Can they feed me back the information that we all need to improve the design? Are my co-authors people who even respond to my emails, right? And, there are people who are great as friends, but not great as co-authors. That's just the reality of it, right? Like, and so like we can stress test some of these relationships with a pilot, and hopefully build trust. Sometimes we build the opposite of trust, but it's much better to figure some of these things out with a small scale pilot than with a large experiment. And after we've designed our portfolio, after we have a portfolio of research projects, there are the realities of the business that we're in, which is that it's a business of rejection. Like most of the times, we get rejected for grants, we get rejected for papers, and linking back to the question of what projects we choose to work on, given the fact that this is a very difficult industry or business that we're in, which is full of rejection, it's just going to be much more easier to get yourself through those tough times when you're passionate about your topic. So rather than like constructing your portfolio of research purely strategically, what do I think others are going to be interested in 3 years, 5 years time? What do I think are the hot topics? That's important as a consideration, of course. But if I'm not genuinely interested in that particular area, like what's the point of working in education if you're not genuinely passionate about education, or working on environment if you're not genuinely passionate about environment? It's going to be very hard to motivate yourself through the tough times when there's a difficulty in the project, when there's a difficulty in getting the paper at conferences or published, etc. And so like it's very important that you find meaning in your work, right? And it's very important to try and consider which topics you find meaning in when you're thinking about your portfolio. And as I said before, you can learn from rejections sometimes, not always. Sometimes reviewers don't have the time to give you feedback, but sometimes you can learn from it after taking a bit of a cooling off period once you get rejected, because rejection is always painful. And another thing that's important, I think, that I thought about quite a bit when I transitioned from like PhD student, where you often quite heavily involved in the micromanagement of projects to a situation where you have a few projects in your portfolio, and it's just not feasible that you would spend as much time as you did on those initial projects with every single one of your projects. And for many of us who have a lot of attention to detail and we like to micromanage things, it can be very difficult transitioning to that stage of allowing others to do that, allowing others. So for example, I really enjoy getting into the coding side of surveys, get really into the details of coding, implementing surveys, piloting, getting feedback. But at some point when you're running like many projects, you can't get really into the details of all of these things, and you have to delegate that task to others. And so that's something that some of us may find difficult to do, but it's really essential if you're really going to manage like a larger portfolio. And then the difficult question of sometimes knowing when to walk away from a partner or even from a project. I mean, there are times when you still believe in the project, even though there's something fundamentally problematic has happened with the implementing partner or the survey company, and you can once you've spoken to the funder, the funders are often very respectful and empathetic. Once you've spoken to the funder, you can pivot to a different implementing partner. But sometimes the project itself needs to have some deep introspective thinking about whether this is a project that should be proceeded with. Again, it's a conversation that should be happening with the funder, and there are more natural ways of doing this now with initially piloting and other phases before going to large scale. But sometimes difficult decisions need to be made about projects. And so other advice, so JPAL have many resources on conducting field experiments, advice on conducting field experiments, practicalities. And so it's a really, really fantastic set of resources that JPAL provided. Also wanted to list that John List, who talks about how to run successful experiments with companies and like 14 tips for carrying out a successful economics field experiment, which is not in the development space. But I found this like very insightful for somebody who's run a lot of experiments. And sometimes there are just these small tips which are very helpful, just even on the language that you're using. So one of the things that he talks about when running experiments with large companies is that don't use the word experiment sometimes, because they get like really scared. Oh, what do you mean experiment? But if you use the word pilot, and it's not like you're not lying, right? It's still the experimental protocol, but for them it's piloting, and often for them it feels like a pilot because it's a few hundred observations and they're dealing with like tens of thousands of customers, right? And so it's piloting to them, it's A/B testing, it's that kind of thing, but it's just less frightening for them. And so it comes to this point about like with maturity navigating this conversation with the implementing partner. I think this is a useful resource that he's written, which is non-development setting, but many points are relevant for us. So thank you very much. I think there's probably like 2 or 3 minutes for questions. Thank you again for participating and staying to the end.
Please feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions if anyone has any questions.
And thoughts, please share any thoughts that you have on other things I should be saying in this presentation, or other frictions that you have experienced in terms of like trying to develop your research portfolio. Please do share any experiences you have, not just questions.
Hi, maybe I can jump in with a small question. Hi, my name is Abdul Razak Tamim. I'm a PhD student at UC Berkeley in the economics department. I was just curious, Mohammed, what your thoughts are on how the bar has been rising in the field of development economics in terms of what constitutes a good RCT, what's the scale, do you do multiple saturations, multiple treatments, and kind of for a PhD student, do you think, in terms of the risk, given how the field has evolved, this is something that might be interested in, and how does it also relate to structural estimation and models? Thanks.
Yeah, so thank you for the question, Abdul Razak. So I think like one of the things that your question made me think about when it came to, for example, the project that I was working on in Kenya. Um, there's a temptation, especially if you're designing like innovative RCTs with like new products, some contractual innovations in finance, or you can think about innovations in some other space like education or health, etc. You often have like many ideas, and there's a temptation to try out like many different things, and that can just be like not a sensible thing to do given the sample size. So I think that's something that you have to like do sometimes to rein yourself in, which is what are the core things that I want to test rather than just testing out too many things. There's a temptation to get a little bit too excited. In terms of the point about like saturation design, so for example, we see some really, really amazing papers that have come out recently where, for example, they've given cash transfers to whole villages, sometimes 50% of the village, sometimes like 75% of the village, and they really measure, general equilibrium effects. And so those are great experiments, right? Clearly, that's like they've moved the bar really high in terms of thinking about like what the impact of these interventions. But the reality is, for most PhD students, you're not going to be able to like run that kind of thing on your own, right? Like that's a really big intervention. It requires a huge team, a lot of funding, right? And so your value add probably a little bit more. I mean, you may be able to participate in some of those projects. Like if you're brought in, it can be great to work on some of those projects. But your value add is probably also a little bit more on the other things that you mentioned, which is that you have a bit more time to work on some of the more conceptual aspects, work on the structural models, some model development, possibly combining it with existing work that's already been done, or with other types of data collection. So that for your comparative advantage is probably to spend more time working on kind of conceptual things combined with hopefully rigorous data collection, but less, designing your own large scale countrywide evaluation. If you can do it, great, but it's just going to be very hard for you in your position to do it, I think. Okay, so I think there are some questions which are specific to me, which maybe I can take offline. One thing about methods. Thank you very much, Raquel, for implementation guide there. Yeah. Yeah, so I think those resources that Raquel showed on methodology, like different types of experimental like methodology, are really helpful. They relate a little bit to the previous question about different methods. So I think we've gone over time, so we should probably conclude here. Maybe there's one more. So how established is RCTs in financial economics? So I think less so in conventional finance, but a lot of development economists, some of the most famous RCTs are in microfinance, and so a lot of development economists have made big contributions to like finance and development. I do see a little bit more in terms of experiments coming into finance, and I hope that would be the case. I hope that would be the case that we see more kind of rigorous impact evaluations and more low-income countries represented in the field of finance. So I think there's nowhere near enough representation of developing countries in finance and finance journals and the field of financial economics, and I really hope that can increase in the future. And there's a great JPL finance team led by Emily Brazier and Emanuele Colonelli, and so very optimistic for the future of finance and development. Thank you very much, everyone.